Anybody on like a modern sport bike, you know, you have a lot of options available to you as far as suspension tuning and the way to set up the bike. It's fully adjustable. You paid for it. Use it. If you're still riding around on the way the bike left the showroom floor, guess what? It's not set up for you. If you're 150 pounds or 250 pounds, something needs to be done. Okay, and it may feel pretty good, but wouldn't it be nice if it could feel a lot better? I think so. So let's go ahead and we'll shoot through this. The big thing about suspension is really it's never the same. Okay, it could change really from day to day. The way your bike is based on numerous different things. The simplest being is the outside temperature and how it affects fluid flow and things like that. How old it is. If you're riding a bike with more than 30,000 miles on it and you've never ever changed your fork fluid, shame on you. You should get it checked out. It's probably a murky mess sloshing around inside your forks there. But it's just like anything else. Suspension requires maintenance. It requires tuning, and to get the most out of it. Just like your motorcycle engine, you know, there's moving parts in there trying to be controlled with fluid flow, and unless you take care of that, it's not going to do its job. And quality is a big thing. It's not so bad now. Since about 2006, the manufacturers, OEM guys, they've been putting some fairly decent stuff on your mass production motorcycles, and there's a lot of guys out there. Your stock suspension is pretty capable, and you can go pretty quick on it at the track if it's set up properly. I ride a Honda CBR 1000 2008 model, and I was surprised at some grimacing faces out there. The Ducati Loyal Honda. I was really surprised at the capability of the stock suspension of that motorcycle, especially the forks. The front forks are outstanding. They're Showa unit on there, and they're really good. And the bike it's a very easy to ride motorcycle, and it just shows, you get the right bike with the right suspension, you can have a lot of fun. And another thing is the speed at which you're riding. If you start out at a track and you have your bike set up one way and it's your first time there, and you start riding that track over and over again, you do 5 track days there, and you move up through the different, and you were a level 1 rider, now you're a level 3 rider, you probably need to change some stuff because you're going faster, and the forces being exerted on your suspension and the speed that's acting upon the suspension components is much greater. Okay, you're going in the corners, you're braking harder, you're accelerating harder off the turn. Make some changes because the suspension will need it. You'll find that as you progress and become a faster rider, your suspension needs to change with you to make increase your capability on the track. It's my little boy. Overall, if you think about suspension, it's basically springs holding up the motorcycle. Okay, 2 fork springs up here and a big honking spring in the back for the rear shock on most motorcycles. Okay, most sport bikes. And a spring is something. It goes. I think about my old science teacher and Newton's third law of motion, where if you just drop that thing on the ground, it's going to shoot back up in the sky, and that's something that's fairly uncontrolled. Okay, so a big part of understanding motorcycle suspension and getting it to work for you is controlling that spring, making sure it's the right one for you, your weight, and the weight of the motorcycle. That's very important. A lot of people don't realize, you just hop on this thing, that spring has to support both the weight of the bike and the weight of the rider. You get a lot of guys, heavier guys, they'll hop on a bike and they end up with 50 millimeters of sag out of their 110 millimeters of travel. You're using almost half your suspension travel just holding you and your motorcycle up. Well, what happens if you're out on the track or out riding, street riding in canyon? You've used up almost half of your travel just with you sitting static on the motorcycle. It's not good. So getting a proper spring for the bike for your weight. Most newer motorcycles, over time, they've kind of figured out that most Americans are kind of big boned Not these little Japanese test rider guys that weigh like $1.25, $1.30 who come in and go, oh, bike very good. Well, we're a little heavier than that. You know, average American guy, living in the U.S., we're about 175 or so, plus or minus, I don't know, 100 pounds. And, yeah, it's Carl's Jr. in and out. That'll get you. So, getting the right spring underneath you and getting the sag set up properly is very important. And there's some different parameters that come into play there for sag setup and things like that. It's better, I always tell people to experiment with suspension settings, but initially, you should really take it to a pro, somebody knows what they're doing, and get a good baseline setup. Because you can wander around for a long time out in the field somewhere trying to figure out a good baseline setup on your own, or you could take it to somebody who knows, give you a good base setup, and then you start keeping your notes and saying, okay, let me change this a little. You go out and ride, no, that doesn't feel good, so you know where to go back to. Okay, you won't get lost. And there's about 1,000 ways to change this, and only a few to make it feel good and proper. Especially some of the newer bikes that have high and low speed damping characteristics on them. You can get lost pretty quick in some of that stuff. So take it to somebody who knows. And we talked about how much is right. Depending on the type of fork and some of its internal configurations, whether or not it has a top-out spring or things like that, there's factors like that you have to take into account when you're setting up the bike and adjusting sag and things like that. But that's the key, okay? Sag has to be set first. Okay, you have to get the bike where it'll work in its proper operating range for that suspension. Then you start adjusting damping, okay? Don't do it the other way around. Never touch the preload. You got to twist these blue ones here before you twist anything else, okay? Because that factor, if you had too much sag and you just messed with the rebound or the compression damping characteristics of the bike, it's not going to be right. If you're using fluid flow to control springs, and springs are stronger than fluid, so you got to think about that. Now, what is a suspension other than a spring? Well, it's a tube that's shoving hydraulic fluid back and forth. It's oil, basically, from one end to the other. And the way that is controlled and the speed at which that's controlled is how you make the suspension useful for your needs. Overall, everything's pressurized, be it with air or like rear shocks. The majority of rear shocks on sport bikes nowadays are nitrogen charged. The front forks, they basically use an air cavity or an air pocket, the gap between the oil level and the top of the fork cap that acts as a pressurization tool, and that keeps fluid flowing properly in there. Your adjustments, of course, rebound damping is something that allows the front suspension to return to its original position. Once it's compressed, it's how fast it returns back to its original position. Compression for forks, generally down at the bottom, designs out there. But overall, you're controlling fluid flow to kind of counteract the spring that's in there and how the forces that it exerts when it's compressed and returned. Okay, and that's almost everything that comes into the ride quality of the bike right there. Once you get the sag set on the motorcycle and it's the proper spring for your weight, and the bike is operating in the proper range of suspension travel, okay, right in here, not too far down the bottom of the stroke or not too high. You want it right there in the so-called sweet spot. Then you're controlling the speed at which it moves with the damping controls. Okay. High speed and low speed. Anybody in here have a bike with high and low speed compression damping on it? A lot of people kind of get freaked out by that term. Somebody's like, I don't even know. New Yamaha R6 was one of the first bikes that came out with high and low speed compression damping on it. Basically, this doesn't refer to, well, I'm not a very fast guy, so just adjust the low speed. That's not what it's for. It's how fast the actual suspension is, the action of the suspension is moving. High speed means it's being, the motion of suspension is something sharp and fast. Like if you were run over like a irregularity on the freeway or something, a real sharp bump, that suspension is acting, the fluid flow in there is at high speed. Okay, or if you're going over some nice roller type of bumps on the freeway or a backcountry road, that's low speed. most suspensions, they don't have a separate circuitry for that. So you kind of have to dial your standard compression adjustment to deal with both sides of that. That's why sometimes if you get it where it feels really good, most of the time you hit a sharp bump and it's like, oh man, my back's killing me. It can't handle that high-speed shock, but handles the low-speed stuff good. There's a compromise there. So over the years, a lot of the manufacturers, suspension guys, they come out and they separated that circuitry. So if the suspension gets fast action, it goes through one circuit for fluid flow. If it's moving slow, it goes through a different one, and you can control each one of those. A lot of the newer, like the new Olin's TTX shock, some of the Penske stuff that's out there, they all have separate circuitry for high and low speed damping.
And front and back?
Yeah, a lot of forks out have front high and low speed damping out now. Like new Suzuki's, a couple of new Suzuki's have them. And it's generally what you'll see is like an outer nut adjuster with an inner screw adjuster. It's generally how you see it. Some of the bikes have double adjusters in the back. So you'll, but that's to control those two different circumstances acting upon the suspension. As you get out on the track, it's all trickle-down theory technology from racing. As you get out on the track, especially at some of the bank tracks or some older tracks where you got real sharp transitions in the pavement, man, and you hit that, it like feels like it compressed your spine. You know, you can use high-speed damping to control that, but then you get up on, like at Daytona especially, you get up on the banking, and I've raced there a few times myself, man, and you get that slow-speed roller compressions up on the banking of Daytona, and man, you can actually, you're getting pressed in the gas tank so hard, you can feel the air get pushed out of your lungs, and the suspension is like almost totally bottoming out in this real slow fashion across there, so you got to control that as well, so it's pretty tricky. Now, what ifs? You know, what happens if you start messing around and you get lost? Well, there's prices to be paid for bad adjustment. The bike's either going to feel, if you got too much or too little compression, well, the bike, it could potentially bottom out. I've repaired many a fork seal from guys with really soft front suspensions. You ever been poking through a parking lot and a guy tries to back out in front of you and you stab, do that panic stab on the front brake and the front forks just collapse on you? Well, that's, you can usually dial that out a little bit. Or guys who are slamming down wheelies, those are the big fork seal exploders there. You know, too soft in the front end, you'll get excessive front end dive. Too soft in the back end, you'll get a lot of squat on the bike, and it'll tend to make the motorcycle want to run wide out of corners. And that's the same for your sag settings as well. If your spring isn't dialed properly, the bike, it's going to be in an unbalanced fashion, and it'll really affect the handling characteristics. So it's something you really should think about. You know, too much, too little rebound. Anybody ever felt, you know, the control of the speed of the suspension moving? Anybody been in those like long sweeper corners and you're dialing the gas and the thing just starts doing this? Get that wallow in the back of the bike, or you get on the brakes hard and the front end's kind of pushing like that. Those are circumstances that's damping that you need to control. 30,000 miles on the suspension, yeah, that's that. When you pour it out, it's all gray and goopy. It's and it all depends on the fork. I've actually had some nice show of forks and with good internals in them, and I dumped out 26,000 miles of oil and it looked brand new. So it's all how bad the friction is in there, how much you've been riding it. But it just, you know, it's like any other maintenance you do on your bike. You know, you get up in the mileage, think about taking care of that suspension so it'll take care of you. Don't expect to roll onto any racetrack around on a bike that's never had its suspension touched and you got 30,000 miles on it and expect to have fun. You're probably going to be fighting back a monster out there. It's not going to be.